You don't need to be stunning. You don't need money. You don't even need to be visible all the time. What you actually need is to understand how the human mind attaches itself to what it can't fully grasp. Obsession doesn't come from being admired. It comes from being unresolved. Think about it. Have you ever missed someone so intensely it felt physical? You checked your phone without realizing it. You saw them online and felt that tight pause in your chest when they didn't respond. You told yourself it didn't matter, but part of you stayed alert, waiting, hoping they'd notice, hoping you still mattered. And when they didn't reach out, you didn't get angry right away. You got confused. You replayed conversations. You wondered what you said, what you should have said, what you could fix. You didn't feel rejected. You felt unfinished. Here's the truth most people never hear. You weren't ignored because you lacked value. You were ignored because you became predictable. You gave certainty in a world that feeds on uncertainty. And certainty, no matter how kind, kills obsession. What they offered you wasn't love. It was absence, carefully rationed. Just enough warmth to keep hope alive. Just enough silence to make you doubt yourself. Hope is powerful because it doesn't satisfy you. It keeps you reaching. It keeps you attached. This isn't new. 500 years ago, Machiavelli wasn't teaching people how to be loved. He was teaching them how to occupy space in someone's mind, how to linger without presence, how to control perception through silence, timing, and contradiction. He understood something brutal. People don't obsess over connection. They obsess over interruption. The cliffhanger, the unresolved moment, the person who disappeared right when the story felt alive. This isn't a love story. It's a blueprint for psychological presence, for becoming the thought that returns when everything else goes quiet. Because obsession isn't about attraction, it's about confusion. The strongest grip you can have on someone's mind is being almost understood, but never fully decoded. If you've ever been overlooked, ghosted, or slowly taken for granted, this is where the pattern breaks. You don't need to chase love. You don't need to explain yourself. You need to become mentally unshakable. There's a kind of pain that leaves no mark, no bruise, no visible damage. No one praises you for surviving it because no one sees it. It's the pain of being remembered only when it's convenient, of once mattering and then fading into the background. You were always the one who reached out. You sent the message. You waited. Minutes turned into hours. They came online. They laughed. They scrolled. They didn't answer. And still, you stayed open. You remembered the little things. You held space. You listened. You showed up emotionally for someone who never fully arrived for you. And when they spoke about connection, your name wasn't mentioned. That's when the question crept in. Quietly. Was I too easy to reach? Too available? Too much? Too soon? That ache isn't sadness. It's starvation. It's the hunger to be missed. To be remembered when there's nothing to gain. To exist in someone's quiet moment, not just their lonely ones. You gave your attention, your empathy, your emotional currency, and what came back was silence. Not neutral silence, the kind that makes you question your worth, not because you're weak, but because you are readable. And in a culture addicted to mystery, being easily understood is a liability. Here's the part no one teaches you. In the economy of emotional attention, what's abundant becomes invisible. You thought generosity would earn depth, but you revealed every page before the book was opened. You let them read the ending before they fell in love with the story. That's why the tension disappeared, not because you lacked value, but because you removed friction. And friction is what keeps people engaged. People don't obsess over what they fully understand. They obsess over what they almost understand. What slips away just as it seems clear. You weren't boring. You were complete. And in a world of endless scrolling and instant answers, completion is forgettable. You became clear too soon, and clarity is where desire quietly dies. They moved on, not because you weren't enough, but because there was nothing left to wonder about. No edge, no silence heavy enough to echo. That ends here, because obsession isn't built on visibility. It's built on absence that lingers, on emotional puzzles that refuse to resolve. In the next phase, we'll break down the mechanism behind this, why people forget the givers and chase the unpredictable, and why Machiavelli saw this not as romance, but as power. This was never about being liked. It was about becoming unforgettable. To understand why interest fades the moment you become emotionally available, you have to challenge everything you were taught about connection. The truth is harsh but simple. The brain isn't addicted to love. It's addicted to uncertainty. We don't crave connection. We crave the possibility of it, the maybe, the unresolved, the spark we almost catch. Think about the person you couldn't stop thinking about. Was it because they were deeply loving, or because they disappeared right when you thought they wouldn't? That single, unanswered message, that pause after vulnerability, that silence that felt intentional, that's where obsession begins. Psychologists call this intermittent reinforcement. It's why gamblers stay at the table, not because they win, but because they might. The uncertainty releases more dopamine than the reward itself. Now bring that into human connection. When someone gives warmth and then pulls away, your mind doesn't settle. It loops. Certainty ends the cycle. Uncertainty traps you inside it. This is where Machiavelli's thinking becomes relevant. He didn't write about dating. He wrote about power. And power lives in unpredictability. What is always available loses value. Scarcity creates gravity, not because it's better, but because being denied wounds the ego. And wounded egos don't detach, they obsess. You were told to be open, consistent, emotionally honest, and that creates comfort. Comfort is safe, warm, familiar, but comfort never haunts. You weren't forgotten because you lacked beauty or intelligence. You were forgotten because you lacked tension. You offered clarity when the mind wanted a question. The people we can't let go of aren't the kindest. They're the ones we never solved. And Machiavelli understood that. He didn't give people what they expected. He gave them silence when they wanted reassurance, distance when they wanted closeness, contradiction when they craved certainty. Make your presence rare so your absence becomes heavy. When you withdraw at the peak of connection, you don't disappear. You embed. They replay the last interaction, not because it was sweet, but because it was incomplete. That's not cruelty. That's design. Obsession isn't built on affection. It's built on architecture. And once you understand that, everything changes. Let's go deeper, because once you see the structure behind obsession, you can't unsee it. Here's where most people get it wrong. They think obsession is about attraction, about chemistry, about saying the right things at the right time, but attraction is only the doorway. Obsession is what happens after the door never fully closes. Obsession lives in the gap. It's born when the mind expects resolution and doesn't get it, when emotional energy is activated but never released. That's why certainty feels calming but forgettable, while uncertainty feels uncomfortable yet unforgettable. You don't replay what made sense, you replay what didn't. And that's why becoming emotionally predictable is the fastest way to disappear from someone's inner world. You were taught that availability equals care, that reassurance equals safety, that consistency equals trust. And while all of that sounds right, it ignores how the human nervous system actually works. The brain doesn't fixate on what feels secure. It fixates on what feels unstable but meaningful. Think about it. You don't lie awake replaying conversations with people who are always there. You replay the moments with people who pulled away at the wrong time, or maybe the right time for them. That's not romance. That's neurological tension. And tension is the fuel. When someone gives you emotional warmth and then removes it without explanation, your mind starts working overtime. You search for patterns. You look for mistakes. You imagine meanings that may not even exist. Certainty shuts that down. Uncertainty amplifies it. This is why the moment you explain everything, the moment you clarify every pause, the moment you reassure every doubt, the emotional loop collapses. And once the loop collapses, interest fades. This isn't about being cold. It's about being unreadable. Machiavelli understood this through power, not intimacy. He saw that rulers who were too accessible lost authority. Leaders who explained themselves too much lost mystique. Those who made their intentions obvious became easy to challenge. The same psychology applies here. When people know exactly where they stand with you, they stop thinking about you. And when they stop thinking, they stop caring. That's why obsession doesn't grow in comfort. It grows in contrast. Warmth followed by distance. Presence followed by absence. Certainty interrupted by doubt. That interruption is what anchors you in someone's mind. Let's talk about the first mistake that erases you before you even realize it. Emotional over-availability. You gave everything early. Your time, your story, your attention, your vulnerability. You believed openness would create closeness, but when the human mind receives too much too quickly, it doesn't deepen. It disengages. An open book read too fast is rarely remembered. You didn't let them work for access. You didn't create layers. You offered full visibility before curiosity had time to grow. What should have unfolded slowly arrived all at once. And when there's nothing left to discover, the mind moves on. The solution isn't pretending to be distant. It's pacing revelation. You don't withhold to punish. You withhold to preserve depth. Reveal yourself like a story with missing pages. Let them lean in. Let them earn understanding. The second mistake is chasing clarity. You wanted to make things feel safe. So you explained your intentions, your silences, your feelings. You wanted them to never doubt you. But clarity feels like closure. And closure ends obsession. Machiavelli understood that clarity is the enemy of influence. The moment people fully understand your position, they stop recalibrating themselves around you. Influence exists when interpretation is required. So, instead of answering every question, let pauses speak. Let ambiguity breathe. Let silence do some of the work. The third mistake is full access. You were always reachable, always responsive, always emotionally present. But here's the paradox. When you're always available, you become background noise. Obsession isn't built on access. It's built on earned proximity. What is rare feels valuable. What is constant fades. Limiting access doesn't mean disappearing. It means making your attention feel intentional, not automatic. When people have to adjust themselves to reach you, they assign you weight. The fourth mistake is over-explaining. You justified delay. Tone changes. Distance. You believed understanding would protect the connection, but understanding isn't protection, it's resolution, and resolution kills tension. Explanation removes mystery, and mystery is where power breathes. You don't need to clarify everything. Let people sit with unanswered questions. Let them wonder. Let your silence become reflective. When someone stares into silence, they often see themselves. The fifth mistake is offering emotional security too early. You showed loyalty before it was earned. You made promises before value was proven. You gave safety before risk was established. But obsession doesn't come from guarantees. It comes from stakes, from almost losing something you never fully possessed. You don't declare commitment. You imply it. You don't promise presence. You suggest it. That uncertainty keeps emotional energy alive. Here's the brutal truth most people avoid. People don't stop obsessing because you were unkind. They stop because you are too generous with emotional certainty, too smooth, too readable, too easy to predict. Obsession doesn't chase softness. It chases tension. The unfinished thought. The unresolved moment. The sense of, I almost had them, but I don't know why I didn't. That loop is obsession. You don't create it by giving more. You create it by holding back, by becoming a story that refuses to end. There's a reason most people never hold psychological power, not because they're unworthy, but because they believe goodness alone is enough to be remembered. They think consistency guarantees permanence. It doesn't. Machiavelli saw that kindness without positioning collapses under reality. Power doesn't reward generosity. It rewards strategy. This is why he wrote that it's safer to be feared than loved, not as a call to cruelty, but as a warning about predictability. Fear here isn't terror. It's uncertainty, distance, the inability to fully grasp. Because what people can't fully understand, they can't forget. Love makes people comfortable. Obsession makes them unsettled. And that imbalance, that quiet tension is where influence is born. Think back again. Every person you ever obsessed over wasn't the most loving. They were the most unresolved. They left something unsaid, something unfinished, something just out of reach. They didn't give closure. They gave implication. And that implication followed you long after they were gone. That wasn't accidental. It was design. And once you understand that, you stop trying to be chosen. You start becoming unforgettable. Now we move from understanding the pattern to stepping into it. Because once you realize obsession is engineered through perception, not effort, the entire game changes. You stop asking, how do I make them like me? And start asking, how do I position myself in their mind? Machiavelli never chased loyalty. He designed conditions where loyalty became the safest option, not through force, but through perception management, through timing, through restraint. And this is where most people sabotage themselves. They believe silence means disinterest. They believe distance equals loss. They believe if they don't explain, they'll be misunderstood and forgotten. But silence, when intentional, does the opposite. Silence creates space, and space invites projection. When you don't fill the gaps, the other person's mind does it for you. And what the mind builds on its own feels more real than anything you could say. That's why people don't obsess over who you are. They obsess over who they become around you. This is the core shift. You are not the object of obsession. You are the mirror. People don't crave your presence. They crave the version of themselves they access when you're near. When you make someone feel seen, elevated, interesting, powerful, and then you remove yourself, you don't leave emptiness. You leave contrast, and contrast hurts. Because now everything else feels flatter, safer, duller. That's not heartbreak. That's loss of identity. This is why absence is so effective. Not because it creates longing alone, but because it creates self-doubt. They start asking questions that loop inward. Did I say something wrong? Did I lose their interest? Was I not enough? And every one of those questions points back to you. That's psychological gravity. You don't pull them toward you. You destabilize their emotional center so they orbit you. This is where timing becomes everything. Never show up exactly when expected. Never reply at the most convenient moment. Never end a conversation after it cools down. End it while it's warm. Cut the scene right before the emotional peak. Leave before the resolution. Let them sit with the feeling instead of discharging it. The human brain hates unfinished experiences. It keeps replaying them, trying to complete the loop. That's why cliffhangers work. That's why unfinished conversations echo longer than perfect ones. You don't say goodbye at the end. You leave in the middle, not dramatically, calmly, naturally, as if you had somewhere more important to be, even if you didn't, because perceived priority creates value. The second shift is emotional precision. Most people respond with emotion. You respond with restraint. They send paragraphs. You send a sentence. They say, "I miss you." You say, "I know." Not cold, neutral, unreadable. Because when your responses are rare, they become heavy. When your tone is steady, every pause becomes meaningful. Your silence turns into suspense. Your words turn into thunder. You're not withholding emotion. You're controlling its release. The third shift is understanding the mirror effect. People obsess over how they feel about themselves around you, not about you. So you reflect what they crave: attention, validation, intrigue. But you never let it settle. You make them feel chosen. Then you shift focus. You make them feel interesting. Then you change the subject. You give glimpses, not permanence. Their ego inflates around you, and when you leave, it deflates. And they don't chase you. They chase the feeling. The fourth shift is pattern disruption. Humans feel safe in patterns. Obsession begins when patterns break. They expect warmth. You give distance. They lean in. You pull back. They expect reassurance. You pause. You become the anomaly in their emotional routine. And when people can't predict you, they can't protect themselves from you. That moment of emotional exposure, that confusion, is where obsession enters. The fifth shift is strategic absence. You don't block. You don't ghost. You fade. Subtly, gradually, with intention. A longer pause here, a delayed response there, a colder tone without explanation. No drama, no justification, just a temperature drop. And that's when the internal spiral begins. They don't ask, why are they distant? They ask, what did I do? And now their mind is working for you. Absence doesn't just create longing. It creates self-interrogation. And self-interrogation always leads back to the source of perceived loss, you. The sixth shift is leaving triggers behind. A phrase, a tone, a specific way you looked at them, a moment that felt charged. These become anchors in their subconscious. So even when you're gone, you're present. They hear your voice in other people's silence. They feel your energy in unfamiliar rooms. They compare every connection to the contrast you created. You're no longer a memory. You're a reference point. This isn't manipulation. It's design. You're not forcing emotion. You're becoming unavoidable. Your presence becomes contrast. Your absence becomes pressure. Your energy becomes the metric they measure everything else against. And slowly, without effort, you stop being someone they talk to. You become someone they think about, someone they dream about, someone they try to replace and fail. Because once you stop chasing, stop explaining, stop overgiving, something shifts. You don't become colder. You become centered, precise. still. This is the new face of power. It doesn't perform. It doesn't plead. It doesn't overshare. It commands space without asking permission. And when that shift happens, everything else recalibrates around you. Your silence grows weight. Your stillness becomes magnetic. Your absence defines the room even when you're not in it. You're no longer trying to be understood. You're becoming the one people work to understand. And that is the line between the forgotten and the unforgettable. At this stage, something important needs to be made clear. This is not about tactics. Not really. Anyone can delay a reply. Anyone can go quiet. Anyone can pretend to be distant for a few days. But without the right internal posture, those behaviors collapse. They turn awkward. They turn forced. And instead of creating obsession, they create disconnection. Real power doesn't come from acting unavailable. It comes from being unavailable internally. Machiavelli never operated from emotion. He operated from positioning. He understood that when a ruler appears too eager, too present, too explainable, authority dissolves. Not because people stop respecting him consciously, but because subconsciously the tension is gone. The same law applies here. If you're silent but anxious, people feel it. If you're distant but needy, people sense the contradiction. If you withdraw hoping to be chased, you leak intention, and intention ruins mystique. That's why the shift doesn't start with what you do. It starts with who you stop being. You stop being the one who needs to be chosen. You stop being the one who needs reassurance. You stop being the one who needs to be understood. Because the moment you no longer need the outcome, you control the frame. And frames decide everything. Most people live inside other people's frames. They react, they respond, they adjust, they explain. They try to repair impressions. They fear being misunderstood because misunderstanding feels like loss. But power doesn't live in reaction. It lives in positioning. You don't correct every assumption about you. You don't rush to clarify every silence. You don't rescue people from their own interpretations. You let them build the story. And once someone starts building a story about you in their own mind, you've already won. Because now they're invested. This is where Machiavelli's insight cuts deepest. Appearances matter more than truth, not because truth is irrelevant, but because perception governs behavior. People don't respond to who you are. They respond to who they think you are. And silence is the most powerful editing tool you have. Modern culture tells you the opposite. Be transparent. Be open. Be authentic. Explain yourself. Clarify intentions. But Machiavelli would look at that and say, transparency is for those who don't need leverage. Unfiltered authenticity becomes access. And what is fully accessible is never feared, never respected, never obsessed over. To be fully known is to be easily discarded, but to be imagined, that's eternal. So you become a contradiction, warm but restrained, present then gone, affectionate but unreadable. You give just enough to spark imagination, never enough to satisfy it. And that imbalance changes how people relate to you. They stop relaxing around you. They start calibrating around you. They edit themselves. They think before speaking. They hesitate where they used to interrupt. Not because you demanded it, but because they can't afford to lose access again. That's when you cross the line from person to presence. And presence doesn't chase. Presence doesn't explain. Presence reorders the room. Now let's talk about identity, because without this layer, everything else falls apart. The world doesn't treat you as you are. It treats you as you believe you are, not consciously, energetically. If you move like someone who fears being forgotten, people forget you. If you move like someone whose absence carries weight, people feel it. This is why obsession follows those who don't seek it. They're not trying to be impressive. They're not performing value. They're not advertising availability. They're grounded in choice. They speak because they want to, not because silence feels unsafe. They show up because it aligns, not because they fear being replaced. And that internal certainty radiates. Once you stop chasing connection, you become selective with presence. Once you stop over-explaining, your words gain density. Once you stop offering emotional access freely, your attention becomes currency. And when attention becomes currency, people pay for it with focus. This is the moment most people resist, because it feels uncomfortable. You're taught that withholding is wrong, that distance is cruel, that silence is avoidance. But there's a difference between avoidance and restraint. Avoidance runs away from discomfort. Restraint creates it strategically. You're not disappearing because you're afraid. You're stepping back because you don't need to prove yourself. And that distinction is everything. Now something subtle happens. You stop trying to be liked. And ironically, that's when you become magnetic. Because people don't crave what's eager to be seen. They crave what resists visibility. They crave what challenges their certainty. They crave what enters the room quietly and shifts the temperature without speaking. You no longer raise your voice. Others lower theirs. You no longer rush to respond. Others wait. You no longer try to be remembered. Your absence does the work. This is where obsession quietly evolves into fear. Not fear of you, but fear of losing access to you. And fear is stronger than desire. Desire says, I want. Fear says, I can't afford to lose. When someone begins to fear losing you, not the relationship, not the routine, but the version of themselves they access around you, you no longer need to pursue anything. They'll pursue stability around you. But here's the key. This fear must be elegant. No threats, no punishments, no emotional volatility. Just consequence. Discipline earns glimpses. Alignment earns warmth. Misalignment earns distance. No speeches, no ultimatums. Your absence becomes feedback, and feedback rewires behavior far more effectively than confrontation ever could. People begin adjusting themselves without you asking. They respond faster. They listen more carefully. They second-guess words they once threw casually, not because you demanded respect, but because losing you feels costly. And now, something critical shifts. You're no longer someone they're trying to impress. You become the standard they measure themselves against. That's real power. You don't announce values. You enforce them through silence. You don't say, I value loyalty. Your absence after betrayal says it louder. You don't say, I hate shallow connection. Your disengagement from it makes it obvious. You don't explain boundaries. You embody them. And those who align will rise to meet you. Those who don't will remember you as the benchmark they failed to reach. This is why unforgettable people don't argue. They withdraw. They don't convince. They recalibrate the environment by leaving it. And that creates mythology. Because when you don't correct how people describe you, the story grows. They call you distant, intense, unreadable, cold. You let them. Every label becomes a brushstroke in the myth they are painting. And the moment someone starts defending you to others, explaining you, justifying you, interpreting you, your image is no longer yours. It's theirs to protect. That's when obsession becomes self-sustaining. You're not managing it anymore. They are. And here's the final shift in this part. You stop offering closure. When asked why you pulled away, you don't deliver a post-mortem. You say something open-ended, something symbolic, something that resists resolution, Some connections aren't meant to be explained. You wouldn't believe me if I told you. And then you leave, not angry, not dramatic, just gone. And in that gap, you expand. You stop being a sentence. You become a symbol. And symbols don't fade. They echo. This is where everything completes. Not with an ending, but with a transformation. By now, you should feel the shift. Not as a tactic you're trying to remember, but as a posture you're beginning to inhabit. Because the final truth is this: obsession is not something you do to someone. It's something that happens when your presence alters their internal balance. And that only works when you're no longer chasing an outcome. Most people never reach this stage because they're still trying to win something. Love, validation, attention, closure. They're still moving from need. And need is loud. Need leaks through timing, through tone, through explanations that arrive too fast, through silence that feels anxious instead of intentional. Power, on the other hand, is quiet. It doesn't rush. It doesn't chase. It doesn't clarify unless it chooses to. And when you fully step into that, something subtle but irreversible happens. You stop being someone they interact with. You become someone they reference. People start mentioning your name without you being present. They compare new connections to the feeling they had around you. They measure others against an absence they can't recreate. Not because you were perfect, but because you were unresolved. You didn't give them an ending. You gave them a middle they never escaped. At some point, they stop saying, "I knew them." They start saying, "I can't forget them." That's the crossing. From human to imprint. From presence to echo. From relationship to mythology. And here's the part most people misunderstand. This isn't about cruelty. It's not about breaking someone. It's not about manipulation in the cartoon sense. You didn't force anything. You simply withdrew at the precise moment your presence mattered most. You didn't collapse the bridge. You walked away mid-crossing. And now they're stuck on the other side, wondering what version of themselves existed only when you were near. That's what they miss. Not your voice, not your attention, not your affection. They miss who they were around you. The confident version, the interesting version, the elevated version. That version lived in the mirror you held up and then removed. And that mirror wasn't made of reassurance. It was built from restraint, from silence, from unpredictability, from intentional absence. That's why they spiral. They reread messages. They replay tones. They search for meaning in what you didn't say. Because silence is where obsession writes its script. And the most powerful part? You don't need to participate anymore. The system runs on its own. Even if they try to move on, nothing feels right. Everything else feels too clear, too safe, too flat. You taught their nervous system what desire feels like when it walks the edge of loss. You redefined intensity. Now, nothing burns the same. That's not romance, that's legacy. They'll talk about you vaguely, defend you to others without knowing why. Feel a tightening in their chest when your name comes up. They won't admit it, but you've become their internal contrast. The standard. And the most brutal realization for them is this: you're not gone. You're just unreachable. You're not a memory they can revisit. You're a feeling they can't recreate. That's why obsession doesn't peak when they want you. It peaks when they fear losing access to you forever. Not losing the relationship. Losing the version of themselves that only existed in your orbit. That fear is quiet, sacred, unspoken. It doesn't scream. It whispers at night when your name appears in a random thought and they don't know why. Now let's bring this to its final form. At the highest level, you stop speaking in explanations. You speak in symbols. You don't narrate your pain. You encode it. You don't say, "I had a rough past." You say, "Some lessons only silence can teach." You don't say, "I've been betrayed." You say, "Some people teach trust by breaking it," and you let them interpret. When people interpret you, they invest. They project meaning onto your shadows. And what they project feels personal because it came from them. Next, you let others define you. They call you distant? Let them. Cold? Let them. Intense? Let them. Every label adds to the myth. And when they start correcting others on your behalf, no, you don't understand them. Your presence has already migrated into their identity. They're not protecting you. They're protecting the meaning you carry for them. Then you make your values invisible, but immovable. You don't announce standards. You enforce them through behavior. Betrayal meets absence. Disrespect meets silence. Misalignment meets distance. No speeches. Your withdrawal communicates more than confrontation ever could. And those who align will adjust. Those who don't will remember you as the one they couldn't keep. This is calibration without sound. Then comes the most important move of all. You never offer closure. When they ask why you pulled away, you don't open the file. You close the conversation with mystery. Some connections weren't meant to be explained. You wouldn't believe me if I told you. And you leave. Not angry, not dramatic, complete. That's when you stop being a person in their life. You become a question, and questions live longer than answers. Over time, something strange happens. You stop hearing from them, but you hear about yourself. From strangers, from indirect mentions, from energy shifts when you enter rooms you've never been in. You've crossed over, from known to felt, from presence to reference. They don't say, "I knew them." They say, "I still feel them." Because you were never just someone they loved. You were someone they couldn't solve, someone they almost had, almost understood, almost held. And the human mind is obsessed with almost. You didn't break them. You revealed them to themselves. You showed them a version of who they could be. Confident, seen, powerful, but only in your presence. And when you withdrew, that version vanished. Now your absence isn't inconvenient. It's threatening. Because losing you means losing that reflection forever. That's why you never need to raise your voice, never need to explain, never need to demand devotion. They seduce themselves trying to regain what they think they lost. They interpret your silence as judgment, your distance as evaluation, your unpredictability as a test, and their emotional world quietly reorganizes around not being erased from yours. That's not manipulation. That's gravity. Unspoken, irresistible. Once you become someone they fear losing, you never chase again. They do it for you. Not chasing love, chasing redemption. A second chance at something you never even said was ending. And that's the final weapon. The fear of never being enough to reach you again. You were never meant to be held. You were meant to be felt. And felt things don't fade. They echo. They become the silence people check. The name they don't say out loud but never stop repeating inwardly. Because power doesn't live in performance. It lives in imagination. And the most dangerous thing you can become is not desired, but mythologized. You were never chasing love. You were becoming a legend.